Welcome to this new session of Transplant International Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Transplant International Podcast, where we explore innovations in organ transplantation and the science moving our field forward. I'm your host, Nina Pilat. I'm Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Transplant International, and thank you for joining us for this March episode. Today's issue is unusually rich and multifaceted. We have advances in surgical optimization, we have molecular biomarkers, and we have health system transformation. So it's three very different domains, but all equally essential for improving transplantation outcomes worldwide. And to walk us through the science behind these papers, I'm joined by my co-host, Emilien, one of our talented editorial fellows at Transplant International. Emilien, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Nina. It's great to be here.
So before we start, you want to give our listeners a short introduction and maybe a very brief summary of your fellowship experience. The call for new fellows was just published, and you can find it on the ESOT website and all our social media channels. I really want to encourage every young professional in the field of transplantation to apply. It's a really amazing learning experience.
Absolutely. So to briefly introduce myself, I'm Emilien, a urologist and transplant surgeon. Being an editorial fellow this past year has been an incredibly enriching experience for me. Working closely with a senior editor allowed me to really understand the behind the scenes of the editorial process. Those regular exchanges have significantly sharpened my critical reading skills and overall scientific level. So I really highly recommend applying. Now, coming back to the scientific content for today, these three papers really captured the breadth of the field. One focuses on the mechanics of surgery itself, one on molecular monitoring of graft injury, and one zooms out to an entire region's transplantation ecosystem. It's a nice snapshot of how diverse the challenges and solutions can be in transplantation.
Thank you. And before we start, as always, we'd like to note that the views expressed in this episode, they are our own and do not necessarily reflect those of Transplant International or ESOT. So let's start with our first highlight, a systematic review by Seizilles et al., looking at the impact of vascular anastomosis time, often called the second warm ischemic time, on kidney transplant outcomes. This is a topic every transplant surgeon thinks about, but surprisingly few studies have synthesized comprehensively. Emilien, can you walk us through what this review found?
Absolutely. So this systematic review brings together 9 retrospective cohort studies covering more than 155,000 kidney transplants. The central question is straightforward. Does the duration of vascular anastomosis, basically the time the kidney spends warm but not perfused, influence outcomes like delayed graft function and graft survival? Despite heterogeneity across studies, the message is quite consistent. They found that shorter anastomosis times, particularly under 30 minutes, were associated with significantly lower rates of delayed graft function. And this effect held true across donor types, living donor, DBD, and especially DCD. Furthermore, longer anastomosis times were also associated with worse 1 and 5-year graft survival in a dose-dependent manner. Patient survival was less consistently affected, but graft outcomes were robust across studies. There is one important nuance to keep in mind, though. A prolonged anastomosis time often reflects a complex case like multiple arteries, a difficult iliac fossa, obesity, or a retransplantation. So it's partly a surrogate marker, not purely a modifiable factor. But still, the data clearly show that non-productive warm time does matter.
That's a key point. Nobody is suggesting surgeons should rush through a complex anastomosis. But eliminating avoidable warm ischemic time or just optimizing the workflow might be one of the simplest ways to improve the outcomes. So what do you see as the broader implications for praxis, for real life?
I think there are 3 takeaways here. First, we need to start recognizing anastomosis time as a true quality metric. It's measured inconsistently today. This paper suggests we should routinely record it. Second, it's about optimizing our surgical workflow. Things like pre-planning, having instruments ready, or using a two-surgeon approach. All of these small changes can reduce idle time. And third, there's a real synergy with cold ischemic time. Kidneys with long cold ischemic time may be especially vulnerable to even moderate prolongations in warm time. So overall, this review gives weight to something many surgeons intuitively feel. Every additional minute of warm time carries biological consequences.
This is a very impactful take-home message, and also a reminder that sometimes the biggest improvements come from refining the basics. So we come to our second paper. It highlights a fast-growing area in transplant monitoring. It's the donor-derived cell-free DNA. This study by Schröter et al. Asks an important question. Is a single cell-free DNA value enough? Or is longitudinal monitoring more informative? So, Emilien, what did the authors find here?
Yeah, thank you. So this is a really well-designed prospective cohort study of 106 kidney transplant recipients who were undergoing an indication biopsy. The authors measured donor-derived cell-free DNA at the time of biopsy, and then again at day 7, day 30, and day 90. They evaluated as a continuous variable. They used threshold cutoffs like 0.5% and 1%, and critically, they analyzed it as a longitudinal time-dependent marker. The findings are quite fascinating, with a single reading of 1% or higher at the time of biopsy, while a single reading of 1% or higher at the time of biopsy did predict a 30% or greater decline in eGFR at 2 years. The most powerful insights actually came from the longitudinal analysis. Patients who had persistently elevated donor-derived cell-free DNA across multiple time points faced a much higher risk of re-biopsy, significant eGFR decline, and importantly, graft failure. What's more, in their time-dependent Cox models, donor-derived cell-free DNA remained independently predictive even after adjusting for both pathology. This implies that donor-derived cell-free DNA captures ongoing injury that might not be fully visible in a single biopsy snapshot.
And that's a really striking result, especially the independence from bump scores. It really suggests donor-derived cell-free DNA may be sensitive to a sub-threshold injury where histology isn't yet fully diagnostic. So from your perspective, what does this mean for clinical practice?
So we're not quite at routine donor-derived cell-free DNA surveillance for all patients, and the authors really emphasize that. But several implications stand out. First, most important, timing matters. A single measurement only tells part of the story, whereas serial measurements give us a dynamic view of what's happening to the graft. Second, it significantly improves how we stratify risk. Patients with persistent low levels probably need less invasive monitoring, while those with rising values need a closer look. Finally, it offers a window for earlier intervention. The biomarker seems to rise well before creatinine, and sometimes even before we see histological change. The next step, I think it will be validating these longitudinal thresholds, providing cost effectiveness, and also figuring out how to integrate this smoothly into our everyday clinical workflows.
That sounds great, like shifting from reactive care to proactive graft monitoring. So our final paper is quite different. It takes a health system perspective. This position paper by Rista et al. Presents a regional blueprint for strengthening kidney transplantation in the Western Balkans. And it's also the topic of our March cover. Emilien, can you summarize the main findings for our listeners, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you. So this is a very comprehensive effort using a modified Delphi process with experts from 6 Western Balkan countries: Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia, along with input from Croatia and ESOT experts. The authors identified 5 major barriers holding the region back. First is legislation. Many areas have fragmented or outdated laws, lacking frameworks for things like disease donation or paired exchange. Second, it's the lack of immunological and laboratory capacity, which often forces centers to send tests abroad. Third, there are workforce shortages, especially when it comes to trained transplant coordinators, surgeons, and immunologists. Fourth, the physical infrastructure is lacking. Many countries have only one active transplant center, for example, and some have none at all. Finally, there's a lack of national coordination systems, making donor identification and allocation inefficient. So to tackle this, the authors propose a pragmatic framework, which is harmonizing laws, strengthening training pathways, investing in immunology labs, and establishing proper coordination networks. The ultimate goal is to build regional cooperation, perhaps even leading to a regional paired donation program in the future.
And this is so important. And transplantation is not only about biology and surgery, it's embedded in systems, politics, and resources. So from your view, what's the broader significance of this blueprint?
So 2 main things stand out to me. First, it's the issue of equity. There's a massive gap between Western Europe and the Western Balkans. If we don't take systemic action, that gap is going to widen. And second, it really highlights the role of societies like ESOT. This initiative proves that scientific societies can help drive capacity building, not just publish research. It's also encouraging that Croatia, a regional success story with world-leading disease donation rates, is involved as a model.
Yes, I fully agree. And the paper emphasizes that progress is absolutely possible. With coordinated investment and political will, the region could dramatically expand transplantation capacity over the next decade and help so many patients. So we come to an end. So across these 3 papers, surgical practice, biomarker science, and health system development, what's the overarching story for our listeners here?
So I think the common thread is that improving transplantation requires action at every conceivable scale. At the microscopic scale, donor-derived cell-free DNA helps us detect injury earlier and tailor care. Then at the operative scale, optimizing anastomosis time influences graft survival. And finally, at the macro systemic scale, legislative and infrastructural reform can unlock access to transplantation for entire populations. So all these 3 papers together show that progress is happening on all fronts, from the OR to the molecular lab to national health policy.
Beautifully summarized. And for our listeners, all 3 papers are open access in the March issue of Transplant International. We really hope you enjoy the read. And also thank you, Emilien, for your insights. And thank you all for listening to this episode of the Transplant International Podcast.
Thank you, Nina. It was a real pleasure discussing these papers today. And a huge thank you to Transplant International for having me as a fellow this past year.
Thank you so much for supporting our editorial team and me today. So that was our March episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Please find the full papers at the Transplant International website. Also, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll be back soon with more news across the field of transplantation and the editor's picks for the April issue. See you soon. Bye.